Continuing with this series of videos about movies that, at the time, were not very well received by critics, but that many of us remember as very good, that never received a sequel, and that, curiously, could possibly get a continuation soon. Today it is Hancock's turn, the 2008 film. And in reality, it makes a lot of sense to talk about it within this category. Because just like what happened with District 9, Constantine, or Event Horizon, Hancock was a movie with a story too interesting to remain as a single installment. In my opinion, it had great potential, a barely explored mythology, and a protagonist who, although he seemed like a mere parody of the classic superhero, was hiding a much more tragic story than it first appeared. In the 2008 film Hancock, John is not presented as a traditional hero. Here he does not appear as a perfect symbol of hope, like Superman would be, nor as a protector who inspires fear from the shadows like Batman. In fact, the film presents him as a contradiction of the superhero archetype we all know, in other words, an anti-hero. Because Hancock is a man capable of stopping a train with his own body, resisting gunshots without any problem, flying at supersonic speeds, and throwing a whale back into the ocean with absurd ease. But at the same time, he is also someone incapable of controlling his anger, his alcoholism, and the destruction he leaves behind. And that, in reality, is what made Hancock so interesting at the time. Because on the surface, John is a superhero, but deep down, he works more like a broken figure, someone trying to numb a pain he could not even explain. He did not remember his past, he did not understand the origin of his emptiness, but he still carried its consequences. Hancock was an immortal being who had lost the memory of his own eternity. That is why the city of Los Angeles does not see him as a savior. In fact, it sees him more as a problem. Hancock catches criminals, prevents accidents, and saves people. But every intervention of his seems to end with destroyed roads, crushed cars, damaged buildings, terrified citizens, or even a completely wrecked train. And of course, it is not that he does not want to help. The problem is that he helps like someone who no longer fully understands the value of small things or the real weight of consequences. For a being who can withstand any impact, a broken street, a destroyed car, or a railway split in two may seem like insignificant details. But for the humans living around him, they are real damage, real losses, and real dangers. And this, in a way, is something that many writers and viewers often overlook in other superhero stories. That is basically the first major conflict of this character. Hancock has the power of a god, but he does not have the patience, discipline, or emotional connection necessary to live among humans. His strength is immense, but his identity is lost. Everything he knows about his own life begins with a hospital bed. According to what he was told, he woke up after being attacked in an alley. He had tried to protect someone, and because of that, he received a brutal blow to the head. His skull was fractured, and he completely lost his memory. From that moment on, he did not remember his name. He did not remember his past. He did not remember his family, and he did not even remember whether he had ever had one. When he woke up from his coma, he had no documents, no identification, and no explanation for his powers. The only things he had on him were a piece of chewing gum and a ticket to see Frankenstein. Then a nurse handed him a form and asked him to leave his John Hancock. This is an informal expression in American slang that means to leave a signature. But obviously he could not know that. For anyone else, that phrase would have been a normal request. But for someone without memory, it sounded like an answer. If the nurse was asking for his John Hancock, then maybe that was his name. And since he had nothing else left to hold on to, he decided to accept it. From that moment on, he became John Hancock. And that scene, in reality, summarizes the tragedy of the character very well, because basically his modern life begins as a blank signature, an immortal body without a history. A man who, as far as the film allows us to understand, has lived for at least thousands of years, but who can still only remember the last decades of an incomplete life. The exact date of that accident is not entirely clear. Some external information places the attack in 1928, during a period when Hancock and Mary were living in Miami. And Mary, by the way, was not just any woman. Although at first the film presents her as Ray Embry's wife, later it is revealed that she was actually Hancock's former partner, a woman connected to him for thousands of years and one of the keys to understanding his true origin. However, the film itself suggests another possibility. The Frankenstein ticket, the theater associated with that screening, and the reference to Boris Karloff point more strongly to 1931, the year of the classic version of the film. And this, in some way, fits better with the visual details that appear in the story and with the idea that Hancock has been separated from Mary for roughly a century. But in reality, beyond the exact year, what truly matters is what happened afterward. Hancock lost his memory and Mary abandoned him, but not because she stopped loving him, not because she wanted to punish him, and not because he no longer mattered to her. In fact, Mary left because she knew that staying by his side could kill them both. And basically, it is right there where the story stops being a simple superhero movie and begins to reveal something much more tragic. Because if we think about it, what seemed like the story of a drunk and destructive hero ends up becoming the story of two beings created to find each other, but condemned to destroy themselves if they stayed together. And the thing is, Hancock and Mary are not ordinary humans with superpowers. The film suggests that they belong to an ancient and immortal species, a race that for millennia was interpreted by different civilizations as something divine. In other eras, they could have been called gods, angels, spirits, saints, or protectors. In the modern world, they would simply be called superheroes. But honestly, that word falls short. Mary explains that they were created in pairs, which means that each one had a counterpart, an equal, an opposite, a half destined to find them. In Hancock's case, that half was Mary, and that rule turns their relationship into something much deeper than a simple romance. Hancock and Mary did not only love each other, they were connected by the very nature of their species. It did not matter how much time passed, how many times they tried to separate, or how many names they adopted in different eras. Something always dragged them back toward each other. But that connection came at a great price. When two beings of their species stayed together for too long, they stopped being completely immortal. Their powers began to diminish. Their resistance weakened. Their healing became slower. Their invulnerability slowly disappeared. And eventually they could die like any human being. That is why Mary says this is how the others disappeared. The pairs found each other, loved each other, became mortal, and died. The union that gave their existence meaning was also, ironically, the cause of their end. And Hancock and Mary survived because they separated. This idea completely changes the way the film is understood. Because Hancock's weakness is not a strange mineral, or a disease, or a technology capable of harming him. His true weakness is proximity to the person who connects him most to his past. Love in his case does not work as salvation, but as a condemnation for both of them. Mary remembers several moments from their life together. In an ancient era, around 4 BC, Hancock saved her from attackers armed with swords. Centuries later, in the 19th century, another attack ended with their house engulfed in flames, and Hancock saved her again by pulling her out of the fire. Each of those scenes reveals the same pattern. When Mary was in danger, Hancock protected her, but by being close to her, his body stopped being invulnerable. That is why we see scars on his body. So when Hancock loses his memory, Mary sees a painful opportunity. She realizes that if he no longer remembers her, she can walk away without him following her. She can allow him to live, saving him from a union that sooner or later would kill him. From her point of view, abandoning him was a necessary sacrifice to save the person she loved. But from Hancock's point of view, even if he could not understand it, it was the beginning of a loneliness that lasted almost 100 years. And that loneliness explains a lot about his condition at the beginning of the film. Hancock is not simply irresponsible, he is lost. He has lived too long without knowing who he is. He has no roots, no complete memories, no clear mission, and he does not understand why the world feels so small to him. His alcoholism works as a form of numbing, but this makes him dangerous. When Hancock is drunk, his powers remain intact, but his judgment deteriorates, and that is what turns him into a public threat. If a drunk human can already cause problems, a drunk immortal can destroy a city without meaning to, or react violently to an insult. Because as I mentioned before, Hancock possesses extreme superhuman strength. He can throw a full-grown whale back into the ocean without really making an effort. He can lift vehicles, throw them, manipulate metal with his fingernails, and move at great speed. One of his clearest feats happens when he stops a freight train by standing in front of it, and he does not seem to suffer any real damage. He simply plants himself on the tracks, and his body withstands the impact. That scene reveals the scale of two powers at the same time, strength and invulnerability, because Hancock can not only exert force, he can also receive it. His body withstands impacts that should pulverize him. Bullets do not harm him when he is in full possession of his powers. Explosions do not seem to affect him either, nor do falls from great heights. He can crash through buildings, hit the ground, or take blows powerful enough to destroy entire houses without suffering permanent consequences. Each of these abilities seems exaggerated on its own, but together they build something more important. Hancock is not meant to be a simple urban vigilante. He is designed as a force of nature, a being who, under normal conditions, does not need to avoid damage, because he simply is not made to be affected by it. And again, as I mentioned before, his invulnerability is not absolute under every circumstance. When he spends too much time near Mary, he begins to lose it. That is why he was able to be wounded during the liquor store robbery. That is why bullets begin to represent a threat. That is why, in the hospital, both he and Mary become exposed to real death. Even so, even while weakened, he retains a physical level beyond that of a human. We can see that he can continue fighting, resisting, and causing damage. But he is no longer untouchable. That transition is important because it shows that mortality does not arrive all at once. His powers fade progressively. Another one of his central powers is accelerated healing. When he is far away from Mary, his wounds close quickly, his body restores itself, and his immortality becomes active again. This explains why the doctors are surprised after his head injury, although he cannot heal his amnesia. The film even suggests that his ability to fly is not limited to Earth's atmosphere. At the end, Hancock reaches the moon and carves the symbol of Ray's campaign there. That implies that he can leave Earth, survive in space, and travel astronomical distances. This suggests that he does not need oxygen in the same way a human does, and he also does not seem to be affected by the vacuum or radiation of space. Besides flying, he can also leap enormous distances. Although this ability appears less often than his flight, it reinforces the idea that his entire body is built to generate overwhelming physical force. His speed is also superhuman. He does not only move quickly while flying, he also reacts and fights at an unmatched pace. In dangerous situations, he can appear within seconds, cross great distances, and neutralize threats before others can react. Added to this is his longevity. Hancock does not age normally. He has lived for more than 3,000 years and maintains a youthful appearance. Mary shares the same quality, and both of them have lived through entire civilizations, empires, wars, religions, and historical changes. Yet their bodies remain almost the same. Hancock also seems to have a connection to atmospheric and electrical phenomena. In the film, he is visually associated with energy in the sky. Mary, on the other hand, manifests weather control more clearly. During their fight, she generates violent winds, storms, and tornado-like forces. Some interpretations also extend the ability to manipulate lightning to Mary. But on screen, her power is expressed mostly through the atmosphere, the wind, and the alteration of the weather. But even before the big reveal, the film leaves clues. When Hancock is near Mary in Ray's house, the temperature rises, and Ray asks if someone turned on the heating. Later, the heat caused by their proximity makes some popcorn start popping. It is a comedic detail, yes, but it also works as a sign. The presence of both of them alters the physical world. In addition, Hancock's symbolism reinforces the idea that his story is connected to ancient mythologies. One of the most repeated elements is the eagle, since it appears on his hat, on his pendant, in his drawings, and on his suit. At the end of the film, a real eagle lands beside him, almost as if it were a sign of recovered identity or an echo of something he once was. This symbol has led many to interpret him as a possible version of the god Zeus, and although the film never confirms this directly, the connection is quite suggestive. Zeus is associated with lightning, the sky, supreme power, and the eagle as his sacred animal. Hancock is also linked to all of that, and those elements accompany him constantly. If the beings of his species inspired human myths, then it is possible that in ancient Greece, Hancock was remembered as Zeus, or at least as a figure who eventually became mixed into that myth. Mary, in that same interpretation, could have been seen as Hera, not because the film confirms it literally, but because several elements fit. Hera was the wife of Zeus, a figure connected to marriage, union, royalty, and family structure. Mary is defined precisely by her relationship with bonds, partnership, destiny, and the protection of a human family. Her rings, jewelry, and symbols of union can be read as visual details that reinforce that association. But Greece would not be the only culture that could have remembered them. If Hancock lived for thousands of years, different civilizations could have given him different names. His drawings seem to point in that direction because they do not show one single identity, but scattered fragments of many. The eye that appears in some sketches can be interpreted as a reference to the divine gaze, the all-seeing eye, or a spiritual memory that observes even when the conscious mind has forgotten. The horse can connect to ancient traditions related to strength, sacrifice, movement, or even to Persian cults such as that of Mithra. The figure surrounded by light may also suggest an association with solar deities, or radiant beings such as Horus or Ra. This would make sense because the pyramid opens the possibility of a connection to Egypt. The film does not confirm that Hancock built the pyramids, but within this mythological reading, the idea works as a symbolic possibility. If beings like him walked among humans, it would not be strange for ancient civilizations to attribute certain great works to gods, heroes, or celestial creatures. For an ancient human, seeing a flying being lift gigantic stones would have been enough to turn him into a deity. But among all his drawings, there is one that is much more important than the others: the child. Hancock does not repeatedly draw Mary. He draws a childlike figure holding his hand. That image changes the interpretation of his entire past, because it suggests that his lost memory is not only the story of a forgotten wife, but also that of a son or daughter who was part of his life before the accident. That detail connects to the plans that existed for a sequel. In the ideas developed after the film's release, there was talk of a young woman with powers similar to Hancock and Mary's. Many interpreted that figure as their daughter. If that was true, the drawings were not just visual traumas. They were also clues planted from the first film. The possible daughter of Hancock and Mary would have added another layer of tragedy to the story. Because if the parents lose their powers when they are together, an inevitable question arises. What happens to a daughter born from that union? Would she inherit their immortality? Would she have the same powers? Would she also be condemned by the rules of the species? Was she separated from Hancock to protect her? Did Mary leave not only to save him, but also to prevent the girl's death? All those questions were never answered, but some unproduced versions pointed precisely in that direction. Mary would have abandoned Hancock and their daughter because she did not want the girl to die. If this was true, the sequel would have transformed the story into a family drama, not just an expansion of powers and mythology. Hancock would have had to face not only his origin, but also the possibility that he had been a father and had forgotten it. There were also other bigger ideas for the continuation. One of them would have taken the story toward the so-called horsemen of the apocalypse. In that version, beings like Hancock were sent to Earth by a creator to protect humanity. Originally, there would have been 12 of them, 6 brothers and 6 sisters, created in pairs and remembered by human cultures as titans, gods, or angels. Over time, humanity would have stopped meeting them or recognizing them. The pairs would have reunited, lost their immortality, and died. Only Hancock and Mary would have survived, but 4 of those beings would not have accepted the original mission. Disillusioned with humanity, they would have hidden for centuries before returning as an apocalyptic threat. The connection to the 4 horsemen would have turned Hancock's story into something much bigger. It would no longer have been just the redemption of an alcoholic hero, but a confrontation between the last guardians of humanity and other immortals who decided to judge the world. The first film was about learning to be responsible. The sequel could have been about remembering why he was created. However, that continuation never came to be. There were rumors, script changes, scheduling problems, possible financial disagreements, in a superhero market that changed radically after the rise of Marvel and DC. That is why Hancock was left behind as a film with a great mythology, but an incomplete one. Even so, its ending works because it shows personal growth. After the attack at the hospital, Hancock understands that he cannot stay with Mary. If he remains close, they can both die. If he walks away, they can both heal. And for the first time in the entire film, we see him making a mature decision. He is no longer acting out of rage, desire, or impulse. He acts out of sacrifice. Mary can continue her life with Ray. Hancock leaves and continues his path as a superhero, even eventually operating in New York. That move symbolizes a new stage for him. He is no longer simply the drunk hated by the people of Los Angeles. Now he is trying to become something closer to a symbol. Not perfect, but aware. Not completely healed, but better. And that, in the end, is the essence of Hancock. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date with all my new videos. I also want to give a special shout out to the channel members. Thanks to you and all of our viewers, we can keep diving into these kinds of disturbing and thought-provoking stories. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. And if you want to support the channel and get access to exclusive content, early videos, and other perks, I invite you to become a member. Just click the join button below this video. See you in the next one. Hey, don't go just yet. If you enjoyed this video, I've got another one I think you'll love. Check it out.